Welcome to a very special episode of the Vital Point podcast. Ordinarily, this is where the episode begins. However, I felt like today's episode needed just a little bit of context before we got started. So my guest on this episode is Katrina Michelle. She was on episode 39, if you've been following the show for a while. And during our first conversation, we had a really interesting talk on one of Katrina's specialties, which is transpersonal experiences. Those experiences which defy explanation by the normal sort of Western model of consciousness, of psychology. And really interesting subject. As it pertains to breath work, as it pertains to working with entheogenic and psychedelic medicines. And so the first episode that we did, episode 39, really was this overview and got into some of Katrina's experiences. And I was really keen to continue the conversation. And when we started to talk about it, Katrina suggested that rather than just sharing in general, she asked if I would be open to sharing some of my own personal experiences. And I thought that was a really great idea, something that was kind of different, unique. As we got into the episode itself, the recording of the episode, I noticed that I was extremely nervous. That was like kind of unexpected. There was especially these moments of sort of verbal dyslexia where words were just not coming out of my mouth in the right sequence. And as I breathed into it, as I kind of got curious about what was happening, because I know how to do this podcast. I realized that it was just nerves from thinking about sharing some of the stuff that I was about to share. And, Katrina graciously explained that this is very normal, that I was going into a very vulnerable place, and she did a fantastic job of holding the space. But I mention it, number one, as context for what the episode is about. Because I do a lot more talking in this episode than I normally do when I'm working with a guest. And also just to give a little bit of context to the subject matter. These are experiences that I've had in the medicine space, outside of the medicine space. And I share them not to brag, not to boast, but to have connection, to let you know that if you've had experiences that are not explained, that you're not the only one. And it's a lot more common than you think. When I went through my breathwork training and we were studying the work of Dr. Stan Grof, one of the things that we studied was a concept called spiritual emergence, which is, the phrase coined by Dr. Grof to explain what happens when people start to have these expanded state of consciousness experiences, start to have experiences that are outside of the realm of normal psychology, and can lead to very beautiful openings and shifts and transitions in someone's life. That emergence can also become an emergency. And especially when the experiencer of that goes for validation, say to a friend or a therapist, and instead of getting support, is met with ridicule, with doubt, with, hey, maybe we should medicate you because that sounds like a psychotic type of experience. And almost all of the people that have suffered spiritual emergency have gotten re-traumatized or more traumatized by going to seek help through normal channels. So I feel like it's very important for us as facilitators, as a psychedelic community at large, to continue to normalize a constructive, supportive environment where we can share our experiences. It's one of the reasons that I am an integration coach. It's one of the reasons that I help facilitate integration circles through organizations like Silo Health and Empathic Health. Because it's really important to have a community that's supportive, even if it's just listening, even if it's just allowing somebody to speak their truth and reflect on it without the fear of reprisal, of ridicule, of, shame. So that is the reason that I shared these experiences. They are extremely personal to me. And some of these things I have never talked about before. Some of them I've only talked about with very close friends, or perhaps in a very small confidential integration circle before. Another interesting thing that happened that I want to mention, especially if you are watching this podcast on YouTube, is that there were a lot of weird technical difficulties, especially as I got into the actual experiences themselves. And I was quite frustrated as we were recording. And Katrina, she told me that this is not uncommon when one starts to talk about these experiences that are, already outside of the realm of, our normal Western understanding. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you need some assistance working with, processing, diving deeper into an experience you have, I welcome you to get a hold of me, get a hold of Katrina Michelle, and just know that you are not alone, and that there is a community out there to support you with these experiences that can be realer than real. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Vital Point. When it comes to self-development, no matter the method you use, the vital point is to practice. If you want to learn methods to transform your life and actively grow into the potential you know is inside of you, then you're in the right place. Welcome to The Vital Point. I'm your host, Jonathan Schecter. I'm a psychedelic integration and transformation coach, breathwork facilitator, and an enthusiast of personal growth. You have the capacity to evolve and bring your intentions and dreams into the world, and there's never been more access to so many incredible modalities that can help you on your journey. This podcast will help you learn about new methods to bring into your life, give you practices to follow, and share stories from practitioners who are doing the work so that you feel inspired to go and practice, because that's the vital point. And I'm super honored today to welcome Katrina Michelle back to the podcast. Katrina holds a PhD in psychology, is a licensed clinical social worker, and is the founder and director of The Curious Spirit, a New York-based psychotherapy and coaching practice offering personal transformation work and retreats. As co-creator and producer of When Lightning Strikes, which is a film, she is seeking to demystify the sometimes unsexy process of spiritual emergence. Katrina is also a member of the Emergent Phenomenology, that's quite a mouthful, Phenomenology Research Consortium, currently conducting research seeking to better understand adverse psychedelic experiences. And this is Katrina's second appearance on the podcast. We had a wonderful first conversation where we talked about spiritual emergence, and we talked about her doctoral research in exploring resistance to spiritual emergence. And it was just such a great conversation that I really wanted to continue it and maybe even go a little bit deeper as we were kind of talking about off camera before. So, Katrina, welcome back to the podcast.
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. Excited to pick up where we left off.
Yeah. So last time we really got into like the sort of the groundwork, right? Of like what is spiritual emergence? Where do these transpersonal kind of uh, beyond explanation of our current gotta talk today, psychology understanding come from? And so I think maybe just sort of like doing a quick recap of like what that means would be a good place to get started. So in terms of spiritual emergence, what does that mean to you?
So, spiritual emergence to me is a natural part of the human developmental process, one that we don't often talk about in mainstream worlds, but it's one that's inherent to our nature, and it involves development beyond the level of ego, and it offers us an opportunity to connect beyond the self to things that may not make sense to the rational mind. It can often include experiences of connecting to the unseen world. And depending on your framework, to you, that might mean connecting to past lives, connecting to ancestors. It could be having psychic experiences. It could be having experiences of spirit possession. And these words all point to a certain experience that people talk about, and everybody's experiences are unique to them. But the idea, when spiritual emergence is embraced and leaned into, is that we expand into greater potentials of our capacity as humans.
Yeah, it's such a interesting time to be talking about this for me because like I've been putting together this workshop all week that is all about the sort of intersection of breath work and psychedelics, and definitely leans on the work of Dr. Stan Groff a lot. And these are all like things that he talks about, and sort of the breath work that I've been trained in, they talk about as these frameworks and these principles, and one of the things that really jumped out at me as I started to go through some of my notes again is that every wisdom tradition has methods of entering into these expanded states of awareness or expanded states of consciousness, whether that's through chanting, praying, dancing, breath work, entheogenic, plants, um, sweating. There's so many different methods, right? But
Yeah.
there's always this method of going within and connecting to this higher part of ourselves, this inner intelligence, as he would call it. And yet in our modern Western culture, we're really disconnected from that, right? And so I
Yeah.
think it's really interesting how the things that are now becoming sort of in vogue and people are getting interested in as in terms of like their healing potential are really like a return to these ancient methods, like
Yeah.
the I mean every if you start to dig, like all the different connections to the breath and spirit in terms of the language that's used, in Hebrew and Chinese and in Greek, in Sanskrit, it's all pointing towards this experience of going within and being able to expand and being able to connect to something deeper and something outside of the ego, like you said.
Yeah. What's old is new again, and we're finding new ways to get there that are not necessarily so tied up with what many have found to be the constraints of organized religion over time. I think that, yeah, rediscovering direct access to these states and embracing them regardless of your religious worldview is what really is serving right now. And it's just such an exciting time that we're talking about it and we're not getting as many eye rolls as we used to.
Yeah, I agree. And in my experience, there's like when these types of experiences have happened, or when I enter into these states, um, there's a lack of doubt or questioning. There's something about the experience itself where you're not, well, is this happening? And
Right.
it's interesting, like within the framework of breath work, right? Like, um, as you start to breathe, there's that thinking mind, there's that like monkey mind, that's asking those questions. Am I doing this right? Why am I doing this? I don't like this song. I should just really stop right now. Or, like all
Yeah.
those kind of like chattery thoughts. Um, and then you get to a point where that it's almost like the volume is turned down, and somehow like you kind of turn around and you're like, oh wait, something's different. And
Mm,
you're not questioning it anymore. So if something was to happen, something visionary or something that's unexplainable, there's that lack of that thinking mind that's like trying to put it into logic or into a container that it understands. And it's just, oh, this is happening. And I
yeah.
guess to me, like, that's so profound because I've lived my life very aware of that analytical piece of my mind, that's always like, what's happening here? How do we understand this? And what's how what is really just asking questions. And so when there's like a lack of that, it's really, oh wow, it's really noticeable, the contrast.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
I
it's amazing
wonder,
that
in terms
filter.
of, yeah, do you would you say you relate to that in terms of your own, the first episode we talked a little bit about you having this experience in New York, like where you stepped
Right.
off the subway and you felt this change. And
Yeah,
so I'm curious if that relates at all.
it does. I mean, I think, and you hear this repeatedly from people. I've been working with people having these spontaneous experiences, even outside of psychedelic use, for a long time. And you hear this repeatedly. The experience was more real than real. So there's the
Mm.
everyday reality that, we can feel, touch, taste, smell, see. And then there's this reality, which when you're transported there by whatever means you're getting there, breathwork, meditation, yoga, psychedelics, or spontaneous opening, when you're there, you don't doubt it. When you're there, there's a noetic sense, like there's something clear and true, and it's beyond the minds, right? We start to recognize that the mind is our filter, it organizes all this information. But when you have that clear, direct experience, it transcends even the mind, even the strongest minds. So I love that you bring up that analytical brain because, yeah, no matter how analytical the mind is, these experiences will trump them every time.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing to think about, that the mind is really filtering our experience in these different ways. And unless we're training ourselves in some way or practicing opening that filter, we might live our entire lives without actually being aware of the filter that's we're existing in.
Yeah, absolutely. Or discounting it. I think this is the challenge with the culture that we're coming from. And I say that we're coming from because I do think that we are expanding as a culture who is willing to embrace a new worldview, a new perspective on these experiences. But yeah, we're trained that even if, my understanding is that we have access to this these transcendent realms all the time. It's very much there. We are a part of it. We are so trained to live within the confines that we've been reared with, where, you know, it begins and ends with the physical worlds, that we're missing what's right in front of our face, which is kind of fascinating to imagine that one could live one's whole life and never know what's right there until perhaps they're dying.
Yeah. I what's coming up for me is like remembering, I think one of the my first sort of exposures to these types of ideas was watching a film called How to Change Your Mind when it first came out. And I didn't know at the time that, you know, one of the main contributors to that film was Dr. Joe Dispenza, you know, who now I'm like, oh, like I read and listen and meditate with Dr. Joe all the time, but like there was this particular
Do you mean How to
scene where
Change Your Mind? Or are you thinking about something else? Because How to Change Your
yeah.
Mind is the recent. Oh, Dr. Joe
Oh,
is
I'm
part of.
sorry.
Yeah, no, it's
No, you're absolutely right. It was what the
yeah.
bleep do we know?
Right.
That's what
Yes.
it
Okay.
was.
Got it.
Yeah.
Uh
Wow. Okay. I'm all over the place today. I think that's
huh.
awesome. Yeah. So there was this scene in there where he was talking about this exact idea, like about how there's so much information that the brain is exposed to all the time that it's
Right.
filtering out the vast majority of it based on whatever algorithmic patterns it's, you know, encountered before and has decided is safe and interesting and, you know, all those other things. And um, he also made this point, which I can't say is true or not, but like he said, when the Spanish conquistadors were coming over and landing on the Americas, the Native Americans literally couldn't see their ships in the
Yeah.
beginning because it was such a foreign idea and foreign concept that like it just didn't register in their brain.
Right.
And when I think about the the science of, if you look at like the visible light spectrum and okay, this is exactly what we see, and then you zoom it out and actually realize that this is just a sliver of the energetic wavelengths that we're being exposed to all the time, it definitely makes sense that like there are things that are happening all around us that we're just not able to process or not open to energetically,
Hmm.
or just not open to, you know, mentally, of like, nope, this is my world, and um, I'm not going to question it. And so yeah, it's amazing that we have access to these different methods of cracking that open.
Yeah.
And um, and I think as I'm getting deeper into this work as a coach, I'm discovering some of the stuff that you are very familiar with, which is like it's not always this beautiful, like blissful experience. Oftentimes it can be very ungrounding to people and very disintegrating. And
Yes.
then that's kind of the work, is like trying to put that back together, trying to figure it out, rather than this beautiful blissful opening that we're
Right.
that's sort of romanticized, I think, within the psychedelic world. You know, oh, I went and
Yes.
I got 10 years of therapy in one ayahuasca ceremony.
Yeah.
Well, maybe there's a reason that something takes 10 years to process without ayahuasca. You know, that's a lot of
Exactly.
transformation, that's a lot of ungrounding, and then you're left with, okay, what do I do with that, you know?
Exactly. Yeah, it can, you know, it can in many ways. That's what exactly we're asking of these medicines and these practices, is to take us beyond what we know, but we don't know what's there, right? We don't know until we
Right.
get there. We can imagine or guess based on people we've spoken to or things we've read about, but no one really knows what they're about to discover when they embark on a journey or practice. And it absolutely can be very shattering for somebody's sense of the world and their self and the world and their reality. And just to suddenly be confronted with so much information that the mind can't even conceptualize it is absolutely ungrounding. And for some, they can work with the material and they can move through it more easily. And for others, it really can take them into a place where they're absolutely stuck and frozen. And that's why we need people like you to help us work with the material and integrate it back into everyday reality. So we're not just left in that abyss and that state of confusion. Because yeah, having access to these worlds is beautiful and transcendent, and sometimes it's really scary. And either way, we still need to come back into our bodies and live in this practical world. So what we do
Right.
with that is really important.
Yeah. After enlightenment, you still got to chop the water and
Exactly.
chop the wood and carry the water. I am in a really interesting space today, like where my thoughts aren't quite matching. I think that's because I'm a little bit nervous just to get into kind of the meat of what we wanted to talk about,
Yeah.
which was, usually on this podcast, I'm doing a lot more listening. And you had asked me about if I would be comfortable sharing some more of my own experiences, which is a little bit of a different sort of space for me to be in here. And I am, I have thought about sharing some things that really I haven't talked about publicly for sure. And sometimes we haven't really talked about it all outside of maybe a couple of really close friends or, um, I think some things just not at all. So maybe that's just making me a little bit more jittery than I normally am, but that's
It
exciting.
makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And, I'm excited to have this conversation with you. And I also want to say, disclosing experiences like this are, it's such a personal endeavor.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
in when I was working with assist the American Center for the Integration of Transpersonal or transformative experiences, we used to train our coaches and our therapists to really respect that moment where somebody is about to share something that's so profound. It's terrifying for them. They don't know how you're going to receive them. They may be questioning reality, they may be questioning their sanity. So, that
Mm.
moment of you being receptive and open and non judgmental is really pivotal. And I think you're illustrating that beautifully by sharing the anxiety that might be underneath the surface here for you, knowing you're about to say things publicly that perhaps haven't been said before.
Yeah, thank you for naming that. And I've found that just me communicating like what is inside of me is something that helps in these situations, like where do feel nervous or anxious about something that I'm feeling, instead of just sort of keeping it inside. And the other thing that comes up and has come up for me is like my intention with sharing this, which I think is really important for myself and for my own practice. um, my intention with sharing it is not to like, you know sit around and tell like war stories, or like, it's
Yeah.
not egoic in any way. It's my desire is that somebody listening to this would relate to it, and possibly get some assistance from it, and um, that it could also fit into their own integration process. I recently had Dr. Saad Al Olamat on the podcast, and we were talking. He shared one of his experiences from like a very pivotal mushroom journey, where he was talking about this experience of like going into the cocoon and coming out as a butterfly, transforming into the butterfly. And that part of how he's integrated that experience is that butterflies show up for him at these very like amazing, like synchronistic times, and that they serve as a way for him to like come back to that place of remembrance and of presence. And what was interesting about listening to that was I started to see butterflies in the same way. Like
Wow.
there was a couple of times where like I was going through something and all of a sudden there was a butterfly there, and I thought of his
Mm-hmm.
experience, and then it kind of like helped me to ground into my own presence, and my own like, okay, I can just stop and take a breath and like
Yeah.
just kind of breathe into the magic of the world and this present moment. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I hope that by sharing my experiences that, maybe somebody else could have a similar kind of impact. So yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I'm a big believer, and I used to run these story shares in New York City. Kind of, that calls it the spiritual emergence story shares, because I think that's exactly what we need to do. It is really hard to give voice to these experiences, but when we do, we normalize them for other people, and when we normalize them for other people, we begin to promote this as the new culture that we are weaving together, where experiences like this are part of the norm, and they become part, more a part of, you talk about not being able to see things that are right in front of you. They become something that we begin to see because now it's a part of our truth. It's a part of our reality. It's no longer fantastic. So I think that's beautiful that you're seeing the butterflies too and recognizing them at those pivotal times.
Yeah. Jump into it. For me, like I would say that my first experience with something that I would consider transpersonal came through my Buddhist practice. That I've been practicing for almost 20 years, and the even encountering Buddhism for me was like somewhat mystical, in that like I watched my grandmother pass from her physical body, and there was like a tangible, visible experience that I had, um, and I felt her presence after that. And the next day I was in this bookstore, and I hadn't read like a nonfiction book in that was outside of like for school, like I never I read a lot, but I always read science fiction and fantasy. And I was in this bookstore and I felt that presence, and it like stopped me and was like, you need to go down this aisle.
Mm.
And I walked down the aisle, and it led me right to this particular book on Buddhism. And like that one experience like opened into really, like, I think everything else that has happened. um every I'm literally here sitting in this chair right now, because of it, and I can trace back these moments, from this present moment to that initial opening. Like it really like was sort of this signpost that changed the
Mm.
direction of my life. um but yeah, like that was the first thing, and then things like that just kept happening
Yeah.
within the context of Buddhism. When I met Thich Nhat Hanh, and when I say meet, like I just went to see him speak, and just bursting into tears, just from his
Mm.
words and how they were resonating. Um, and then meeting my main teacher, that happens every time I see him, and most of the time when I just, if I'm watching him, but definitely when I see him like in person. And that's from the first time ever meeting him. Um,
Wow.
those type of experiences that are, like you said, realer than real.
Yeah.
Like I have no idea why I'm crying.
Yeah.
It's not like there's not an emotion other than joy and presence, and just being completely in the moment. as opposed to sort of like, I would guess, like normal crying where there's some sort of
Mm,
trigger, or there's some sort of
right.
release, or emotion. And it's almost like I just get so overwhelmed by the energy, the
Yes.
presence of the energy. And there were I ended up going to live in Tibet for a year, and I spent a lot of time in his monastery. And on the road there, um, there were several more of these type of experiences, like working with another one of my teachers during retreat. Um, yeah, I remember during this retreat, we were doing the practice, and there was like this column of rainbow that just shot out of his chest, like
Mm.
into me. And this was like several
Wow.
minutes just sitting in this like column and trying to keep doing the mantra and keep the visualization, but just being completely enveloped by this experience. And I remember the acceptance that I felt from him during that experience. He wasn't like looking at me going like, why is this kid crying? It was just like, yeah, I know, you know.
Wow.
Um
Beautiful.
and then going to Tibet, it was like it almost made those things like normal, because like we would be in these places and you would see footprints in the rocks. Like the first time I saw that, it was like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's something you don't see every day. But then like the 10th time you see it, you're like, okay, this is, I guess it's not that weird,
Oh,
you know?
wow. That's amazing.
But yeah, like I got to go and live at his monastery, which is about 11,000 feet elevation, about 3 hours away from the nearest electricity or, tap water, any sort of running water. But when you got into this area, the energy there was so, like, it's hard to describe, but like you wouldn't have to try to meditate. Like if you sat down and you started to focus on
Mhm.
your breath, you would just drop into these like really deep states without a
Yeah.
lot of effort. And there were these caves everywhere, like in the area of like where people had been meditating for hundreds, thousands of years. Very prominent figures within Tibetan Buddhism like had done multi-year retreats in some of these caves. And like even the monastery, there was an upper monastery. I was living in the lower monastery, um, where there was like a village and a school where I was teaching English, and most of the monks were up in this upper monastery. And I got to go up there, and there was a my teacher, one of the things he's known for is like he always has this prayer wheel. And this, if you're not familiar with a prayer wheel, like it looks like a wheel that's he's spinning that has millions of mantras and prayers in it. And every time he turns that, it's sending those prayers and that energy out.
Yeah.
And it's like it's a way to like focus that spirit and that energy, and amplify it. And there's a prayer wheel there in the upper monastery that turns by itself. Like
Hmm.
no one's turning it. It's just going on
Wow.
the energy.
That's
So like
amazing.
so this is like the environment that I've found myself in even before like experiencing things within the psychedelic space, you know.
Oof.
Um,
It's almost like, did you really need psychedelics? I mean, wow, what you're talking about. It's incredible. It's incredible.
yeah, it is incredible. And I feel really, really grateful to have those experiences and to have met those teachers. Um, like very little about that year was like from A to B, or like what one could just expect to like have happen if they were
Hmm.
to, just go to this country. Like there was this protection and kind of like guidance every step of the way, really.
Yeah.
Um, and things that happened that I just didn't really think about, that I was just like, okay, this is what's happening. And I've had lots of opportunity to like look back on some of those things. And some of them I've had the chance to sit there like as sort of a as an adult, quote unquote, and be like, wow, that was really risky, or like that
Hmm.
was really dangerous. And I didn't think about that at all. Like there was no hesitation or doubt. It was just like, oh, this is what we're doing, this is what's happening,
Right.
and just being guided by that feeling. And that's actually something that like I've worked on reconnecting with in the last few years, like where I started to feel like I wasn't being guided by my thoughts or my brain, that I could open to what was happening in my heart and let that
Mm.
like be my guide. It's almost like the way I describe it, even though I didn't have this frame of reference back then, what it feels like now when I connect to that space is it's like there's like a compass in my chest that's just sort of like giving me the direction. It's just
Oh,
pointing to
I love
that
it.
direction that I need to move in. And if I
Yeah.
open to it, if I surrender to it, like I don't have to like question, is this the right thing to do? It just is there. And I feel like a
Amazing.
lot of my work is trying to stay as connected to that space as I can, because I go through periods where I feel like I'm really connected to it, and then I go through periods where I feel like I'm like way back in my head and
Yeah. Yeah.
kind of disconnected from it.
Hmm. Hmm. It's really a special thing to think about, though, how the heart knows. We say that kind of casually, listen to your heart, trust your heart, but
Yeah.
to actually be in touch with understanding the difference and having that felt sense of truth within versus the analytical mind, which, thank you, we need an analytical mind. It's a wonderful gift to have. And also, we need to be able to hear the heart, because that's when I think we can really lean into the fullness of our own paths, is when we can really listen to what we're here for, being guided by, and not just making those analytical decisions that can only take us so far.
Yeah. And thank you for bringing that up, that both are necessary and they're not really separate, from a certain perspective,
Mhm.
right? Like, and I think that the way that I understand that is through that lens of Buddhism, of the way that Buddhism describes the non-duality. That emptiness is form and form is emptiness. You can't really have one without the other, and they are separate, but they're not separate at the same time.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I am very fortunate for Buddha to my Buddhist practice for like giving me a lot of the framework to understand this type of stuff, and certainly it's not the
Yes.
only framework, but it's like what has made sense to me. And then when there are things that have come up in the medicine space that are like, whoa, what's going on here? It's a blessing to be able to like go back to that framework and say like, oh, this makes sense. And I know that I'm not the only one with that, right? Like, Ram Dass and Timothy
Mhm.
Leary, published interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead for people using psychedelics in the 60s, you know, like, because Timothy Leary read the Tibetan Book of the Dead and was like, this sounds like an acid trip, you know, like,
Mhm.
so it's incredible, like, how those experiences, like, we're able to use the ancient wisdom traditions to help us understand, you know, and realize that, like, hey, we're not alone in this. Like, you know, you're connecting to
Mhm.
something that's much bigger than the small I, um, or just this life experience that you have.
Yes. Yeah, that gives you the capacity to navigate the psychedelic induced states.
So yeah, I guess the next thing that I wanted to share about was like starting to work more intentionally with plant medicine. And I was
Mhm.
saying that the Buddhist practice gave me a framework for things that came up during the medicine experience that were sort of like, oh, this is something within my psyche or within my mind because I've practiced this, or I have
Yeah.
a reference for it. And then the stuff that was a little bit more, what's happening here, was where I didn't have a frame of reference for it. The first time I sat with ayahuasca, I encountered this being that was like this warrior, wearing this kind of loincloth, um, like an animal skin, and he had like this like spear. Um, and at first, like, I couldn't even really make out his features. It was just I knew that this being was there, and I started to just kind of expect that in the medicine space he was going to show up, and it was actually something that, like, I would work with my somatic experiencing therapist with. And like over time, it just, he kept showing up. It started to almost be like the beginning of a resource for me, you know, like I would, as I would be doing integration work with my therapist, and you know, she would ask me like to call in, is there somebody that you can call in to support you and to protect you, or to like to lend you support. I would go to this figure. And I guess in the beginning I thought, this is my higher self, or an aspect of my higher self,
Mhm.
which I still think is true, but I think that relationship has gotten a lot more complex. Um, so there was one night, and I actually wasn't in the medicine space at all. Um, to be fully transparent, I had taken some MDMA much earlier, but I was done with it. I was not in
Mhm.
I didn't feel like I was in an altered state, but I was
Right.
I was I was laying on my bed, and this song came on, a song by an artist named Manish Damore, and he's sort of like a medicine artist. And it was uh, like, in the song there was um, the mantra of Shiva, the, you know, like sort of the mantra that everybody knows, the Om Namah Shivaya.
Mhm.
But there was also this other, the song is called Triambakam, and there was this other like mantra, and that he was singing. And for some reason, um, I got really curious about well, what does that Triambakam mean? You know, what else is going on in this song besides this Om Namah Shivaya that he sang? And I picked up my phone and I Googled it, and the first thing that came up was that warrior from my experiences. And my experience of Shiva at that point was like the dancing Shiva,
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
Nataraja. I had no idea that there were these other avatars, these other manifestations of Shiva, and that this particular Mahadeva manifestation, that the Triambakam was his mantra. And as soon as I
Wow.
saw that, I mean, I just immediately again just began to like weep and feel this
Yeah.
connection to something that was a lot bigger. You know, my heart just kind of cracked open, and I was there with the song and the energy, and like there was a lot of stuff that started to make sense in that
Mm-hmm.
moment, you know, of like, oh, that's what I've been seeing, and this is this connection. Um, and that sort of experience like actually continued through the weekend, like in this variety of ways. Like I went to the self-realization fellowship, Lake Shrine in Los Angeles with my dad, and there was an experience that kind of was like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
we're not done with this yet.
Wow.
There um but that, like, again, there was no prior reference or like understanding, whereas
Yeah.
like if something Buddhist would pop up in the medicine space, it was like, oh, that I could use my
Yeah.
analytical mind to like explain that.
Uh-huh.
And this was totally different. um so I think that that really started to like deepen that connection and that relationship to something like outside of myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then the kicker, this is, I mean, several, I would say probably at least 6 months later. Um, my partner and I were in the middle of a mushroom ceremony, and I I remember having a thought that I needed to make an offering to Shiva. And I remember getting up and taking like a tea light candle and lighting it like as an offering. And at that point, um, Shiva came into my body, and I was like a. You ever seen Being John Malkovich, where like when they're
Mm.
inside John Malkovich and they're watching themselves be inside somebody else's body?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's exactly what it was like. Like I knew that I wasn't in control, that there was this
Right.
other energy within me.
Yep.
Um, and the amazing thing was my partner immediately noticed it too.
Uh-huh.
And I was like sharing this consciousness with Shiva. I knew what was happening. He was there to do this healing on her. And
Wow.
I'm not even going to say he
Yeah.
started to dance, And that was like a really important part of this, was like
Uh-huh.
that when we've talked about it after that, she's told me, she's like, that's one of the ways immediately I knew that there was something different, because you dance a particular way and you were
Aw.
moving in with a completely different presence, with a completely different
Wow.
energy. And I was just watching myself, my body, do this dance, and through this dance doing this like energetic healing. And I was
Mm.
watching what it was doing to her. Like I could see the lines of energy, and like he was working on her chakras, and like it was incredible. And again, like realer than real.
Yep.
And
Mm-hmm.
she, she was sitting there just like crying, watching. And um I remember at the end, he said like, I mean, we've done a lot of integration around
Mm-hmm.
this particular thing. Yeah, there was like a couple of things that he said, like, because in the beginning, she was kind of like looking at me, trying to figure out, like, I could see her mind trying to like figure out what was happening. And I
Right.
remember saying, like, look with this eye, don't look with these eyes.
Yep.
And she kind of got it, and she relaxed into whatever was happening. And then at the end, he said, I'm here to teach you, to love you, and to serve you, and he kind of like
Mm.
bowed, and then it was done. And as soon as it was done, like I was like completely energetically drained. Like I literally just kind of fell over onto the mat, and was
Amazing.
just like spent.
Yeah. Oh,
And I mean, this was like over the course of maybe 5 to 10 minutes, this was going on.
yeah.
And again, like I have absolutely no doubt about
Mm.
that happening.
Yeah.
I know that something happened. I know that
Yeah.
there was
I have chills
some other
listening to this.
presence.
Uh-huh.
There's some other presence there that was not me. It was a very, very distinct feeling and experience of like watching this higher intelligence inhabit my body, and like
Mm.
having a little that shared just from being the vehicle,
Right. Of
that
course.
I could see what was going on. I could see like this higher dimensionality of what was happening, but
Yep.
still like being that human sort of in the corner watching, being like, what
Mm-hmm.
is happening here? um
Amazing.
and in terms of integration for that, that's still something that like I am working on integrating for sure.
Yeah. I mean,
And
of course, kind of a big deal to
you know
have Shiva
yeah,
inhabit your
yeah.
body.
Well, like when I remember during our first conversation when we were talking about the transpersonal experiences, and I think I said something that I was alluding to, where it's like you have these experiences and then you're like, what does this mean? Like, am I supposed to just
Yeah.
go live in an ashram now and like
Yeah.
drop everything else in my life? Because I've seen it, I've
Mm-hmm.
experienced it. It's not like something I'm reading about in a book.
Right. Right.
And it also feels like, well, this is so significant, it has to mean something. Like there has to be some sort of reason for it, and like I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to let it just slip away
Of
or
course.
go back to like life as I know it.
Mm-hmm.
you know?
And it doesn't seem like you're doing that. It seems like you are actually being a vehicle for people to understand these spaces, understand their own experiences with this work. And again, it's super brave of you to share this so openly.
Thank you. I remember talking with my therapist about it, and she said, "So, do you think that was that you?" And I'm like, I really don't know how to answer that question,
Mm-hmm.
But what I can say is that being able to call upon that part as a resource has strengthened. It's something that I've continued to work on.
Yeah.
And it's still like, it's not something where I have an expectation of like being done with it or being able to
Mm-hmm.
understand it. In fact, earlier this year, I had the opportunity to go and help lead a retreat, where I was able to offer meditation and breath work, and I lead all the participants through an ice bath. And it was a big level up in terms of like stepping into this new role, and outside of like Jonathan as a corporate employed, business systems
Yeah.
analyst.
Uh-huh.
And there was a lot of resistance that came up around it,
Mm-hmm.
while I was there. There was a lot of like doubt and like fear, and at the same time like excitement for like, yes, I feel like I'm really stepping into something.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a journaling activity during the retreat where that was one of the journaling prompts, was like, write about an encounter with a deity that you've had.
Oh,
And I
wow.
ended up writing about this, and it really unlocked a lot. Like, I was sitting
Yeah.
there like after I ended up sharing it with the group, and I had no idea that sharing it would have been as emotional as it was.
Mm-hmm.
Like it like unlocked a lot within me of like, oh, it was almost like, hey, remember that thing? Like, you're not done with it yet, and you need to pay
Yeah.
attention to
Yeah.
it. And that kind of continued through the next couple of days, where like I reconnected to that energy. It helped me let go of a lot of fear and shame,
Mm-hmm.
because that was what was coming up, was like, how could I still be working a corporate job? Like, how could I not have completely changed my life? Like, I've read about people that have experiences like this, and they like, it's completely transformative.
Yeah.
And here, like, I've had more than one of these experiences, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
still like, I still haven't gotten the message yet. Like, what's the matter with me? And when I opened up to that, the response that I got was like, I'm always here. You just have to
Mm-hmm.
remember. Like, and there
Yeah.
was no judgment. It was all love. It wasn't
Yeah.
like, you have to remember.
Yeah. Right.
It was just like, I love
Mm-hmm.
you, and I'm always here.
So beautiful.
Right. Yeah. It comes from that yeah, that human place, right? That like that analytical and sort of normal state. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I guess what's coming up for me right now in the moment is like just like I've been able to look back over the course of like 20 years to like things that happened in those like early years of Buddhist practice and see like, oh,
Hmm.
that actually led me exactly where I am right now. Because
Hmm.
like a lot of the things that I skipped over, for instance, are like I met my ex-wife in Tibet. The reason I came to
Yeah.
Arizona was, to following that relationship. And the dissolution of that marriage is what led me into coaching and led me into,
Hmm.
more inner exploration and healing with plant medicines and with breath work, and like led me into what I'm doing now. So there's a certain amount of clarity where I can look back and say, oh, and connect those dots. And instead of being hard on myself or judgmental, I'm guessing that at some point I'm going to be able to look back on what I'm going through now and what I feel like I'm struggling with now and see, oh, all of that was necessary and a part of the journey. And like, instead of being judgmental about it, like see how it all fit into the bigger picture.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's some sort of clarity, I think, sometimes that like integration gives us that it's challenging to have when we're in the middle of it.
Yeah. How could we, right?
Right. Yeah.
How does it feel talking about all of this?
It feels like another step, like
Mm,
in terms of like opening and really just trusting, rather than like being judgmental about it. I think like kind of what I've been talking about.
yeah.
Um, I certainly like I feel very quiet and still in my body. Like there's like
Hmm.
a stillness, a lack of agitation, I would say.
Mm,
And not to say that like I wasn't really conscious of it before and when we started the recording, but it was definitely
hmm.
coming out in my words, in
Yeah.
terms of like sort of almost getting like this weird dyslexic kind of thing where like there were words
Hmm.
coming in the wrong order. And
Right.
um and then was like, oh, what is that? And I could kind of breathe into it and go, oh, I'm nervous about sharing this stuff. And right now I feel very, very still. And I feel very grateful to you for listening and holding space and finding it interesting, you know?
Oh yeah. This is the most interesting thing for me. I love listening and I'm just so grateful to witness your sharing because it's like you're back in that experience when you're reflecting on it. And so to be in the presence of that energy for me is really special.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. It does feel like I'm back in it in some way.
Hmm.
I think that's where that stillness is coming from.
Mm,
Yeah. I'm not sure how the silence is translating for the podcast, but it feels natural in terms of us having this conversation.
yeah, yeah. Well, we all need more
Yeah.
stillness and permission to access it. So,
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like the last so so this sort of I would say like this chapter began at the sort of tail end of 2018. And for like 3 years after that, there was a lot of expansion and a lot of ceremonies and medicine experiences and a lot of working on myself. And
Mhm.
in the last year, really, I guess the last like 18 months, um, I've been, I can't say that I've been completely psychedelic sober, but it's been much, much more microdosing. And,
Mhm.
even when I have journeyed, the dosage has been a lot lower. And I know that this isn't unique to me. Like I know like Beth's talked about it too. And I wonder if you can relate to this. Like it's almost like I've become more sensitive to medicine. Like as I've continued to work with it, like I
Mhm.
can go deeper with less.
Yeah,
But
that makes sense.
I haven't even really had what I would call like these really like deep experiences. They've been very microdosing and kind of like it's been much more focusing on integration. And so it's like
Mhm.
it's almost like I had like a heck of a lot of stuff that I worked through and had, experienced in a short period of time. And because of that, it was like, oh, okay, now I just need to like take a step back and,
Uh,
you know, and breathe into it and like be curious about like what does this mean and continue to try to unpack it. Because when there's stuff that's happening like week after week or like you're sitting like once a month or something like that, it's almost
yeah,
like even that Shiva experience,
right.
it's not like I had the space to just like, okay, this is what I'm working on in my integration, this is what I'm working on in therapy. Like yeah, it was a big milestone or a big like marker on the road, but then I jumped into another experience or I had something
Yeah.
else come up that I had to like that was like very acute in the moment of like this is what I'm working on now. So um I guess I wouldn't recommend that to other people, in terms of like it's
Yeah,
it's it's okay to like titrate it a little bit. It's okay to give yourself some
exactly.
space between those experiences. And certainly like we've been talking about so that it doesn't become disintegrating,
Mhm.
um, so that you can get some therapeutic benefit from those experiences rather than losing it in the moment, or
Exactly.
being
Yeah.
overwhelmed by everything else that's happening.
Yeah.
But it is, yeah, it does feel really nice to go back to that space for a moment.
Mhm. Yeah.
And
Well,
I
maybe
I
there's more
think
for you there to work with too.
I definitely think that there's more for me to work with. Um, yeah, absolutely. And I'm really appreciative of what I've been able to experience and like understand out of those experiences, themselves.
Yeah.
Like, and some of it is just, some of it's funny. My teacher, the one that I had that experience with the rainbow with,
Mhm.
he was the one that suggested that I go to Tibet. I I wanted to do a 3-year retreat, which is like a traditional thing within the lineage that I practice in. And I
Right.
was like gung ho on doing that. And so I was doing the preparation work for it. That was my goal. Like I had stopped
Mhm.
working. I was living in upstate New York with my grandfather on his farm so that I could just have the space to do this preliminary practice and get myself to this place where I could go be isolated for 3 years and just practice meditation.
Yeah.
And he said, that's cool, but why don't you go become a translator? And I was like, I don't know how to do that. I don't have any money to go to school for that. And he's like, you don't need that. Just go teach English in Tibet. We'll take care of it. So like that was this moment where I was like, okay, cool, trust, right?
Yeah.
And then before I left, like this is months later, we were going to lunch, and he said, "You like girls?" And I said, "Rinpoche, like, I want to do a 3-year retreat. Like, I'm not trying to get involved in a relationship." And he looks at me and he goes, "I think when you go to Tibet, you're gonna meet a nice girl."
Oh,
And I'm like,
wow.
"Dude, like, I want to go do this retreat. What are you talking about?" Like, I kind of laughed at him. I was like,
Mm,
"Okay, yeah, sure." And then I met my ex-wife when I
yeah.
was over there. She actually was one of the people that came with us. Like, I met her on the way and we bonded
Wow.
through that experience, right?
Fascinating.
And apparently he had said something similar to her. Like,
Mm.
he had a picture of he and I, and he was like, "Hey, what do you think of this boy? He's a nice boy, isn't he?"
Oh
And
my
she was like,
goodness, I love it.
"Okay, yeah, sure, whatever." And I remember like a couple, I guess I want to say like a couple of months after the first round of ayahuasca ceremonies. Um, I had this experience with the medicine Buddha. I opened this book randomly, and it was talking about the medicine Buddha, and I had this vision of these medicine Buddhas. And if you're not familiar with the medicine Buddha, he's blue. He's a blue Buddha, and he has this bowl of medicine and this medicinal plant. And at the time, there was like a lot of synchronicity between that and ayahuasca.
Mm.
But the name of my brand is Blue Magic Alchemy.
Hmm.
Both Shiva and the medicine Buddha are blue. So it's like the
Oh,
reason that like
yeah.
that whole idea came out of these experiences. And as I was having this experience of these visions of the medicine Buddha, that teacher came to me, and he was there and he was like laughing, and he said, "Do you get it now? Like, do you
Oof.
understand?" And I mean, he was a jokester, so like he like
Uh-huh.
wasn't it was very like jokey. Like he was like, "Oh, you get it?" Like, and kind of laughing
Oh, that's
about
so
it. And it was
cool.
like, "Oh my God, like, yeah, I get it. Okay." Like,
So
do
cool.
you get why all this had to happen?
Mm.
Because at that point, like, I was still like, I was really hurting, and like I was married for 11 years, in this relationship for like 13 years. And I had been out of it for less than a year. I was still
Mm.
really starting to peel off some of the top layers and asking a lot of questions in terms of like, why did this happen? And,
Yeah.
and there he was like, "Do you get it?"
I love it. That's great.
Yeah. So yeah,
Mm.
it's you're right. There's definitely a lot more there for me to unpack and to work with. And I am grateful for the ways in which it continues to unfold and present, you know. It's a beautiful thing. Thank you. Yeah, I love that we've connected around this, because like I just remember going through my breathwork training and like getting this very cursory introduction to Stan Groff and like the work that he was doing, and feeling amazed that like other people have had these type of
Yeah.
experiences, and that there's like
Oh,
doctors and like people that have written books about it and like
yeah.
catalog stuff. And I remember one of my mentors like saying, if you there's this one book by Stan Groff that you should read, and it like catalogs all the different types of expanded consciousness experiences. And if you've had an experience that isn't in this book, go contact Dr. Groff, because he would love to talk to you. And that's how extensive this,
Wow.
this compendium of experiences is.
Hmm.
And I was like, whoa, like this is
Yeah.
amazing. This is some interesting stuff. I want to know more about
Right.
this. And
Yeah.
then, meeting you and getting to know you, and like, oh, this is what you studied for your doctorate.
I know, right?
Amazing. Like, tell me
Tell me
more.
about it.
Like, I just want to know.
Yes. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. It's so thrilling for me, and it's, I think it's where we're going. I think people are ready for more. I think they're hungry to get back to these, the truth in these transcendent experiences. And again, I think more people are having them than let on. So let's give people
Yeah,
permission and keep sharing and keep opening up for other people to explore with us.
absolutely. And, find the communities where you can share, because you are going to
Yeah.
be accepted and heard
Yeah.
in the right place. And like, yeah, it's scary to think about opening up some of this stuff, especially if it's like, I mean, I remember going back into work after like ayahuasca ceremonies and like walking into
Mm.
meetings, and it would be like, so what did you do this weekend? And I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't even know how to begin to answer that
Exactly.
question, and
Yeah.
I would not feel comfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
So,
Exactly.
to have the kind of um community and environment where you can share this kind of stuff is so crucial. And
Yeah.
I love what you shared earlier about the the story time. And
Yeah.
I know you're involved in integration. And
Hmm.
I'm really appreciative for people like you that are out there like spreading this message, and being accepting of it, like holding the space, and
Yeah.
witnessing and listening, as well as sharing and having your own experiences, because it means a lot.
Mm.
Just leave it at that.
Yeah. 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 Well, thank you. I agree. And yeah, we're on similar paths holding space for others in this way. And it feels really nice to know you a little bit more deeply after your shares today. So thank you. Thanks for going there with me.
Yeah, thanks for suggesting it. It's
Yeah.
definitely cool. Um, okay. Well, if you haven't listened to the first episode with Katrina, I would definitely recommend that. It will give some more context around this, and there's really great information. I remember we got into some of the harm reduction aspects, and just, more context is good. Um, I've been really experiencing that lately, of like, we're sort of in this weird attention deficit space now, where everything's like TikTok and reels and really short form. And that can be good, but context is also really good and really important. And so I definitely recommend checking out that first episode, if you haven't already. And yeah, checking out The Curious Spirits, and with your film. It's called When Lightning Strikes,
Yes.
right?
The lightning strikes. Yes. Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, it basically goes into a lot of these topics, right?
It does. Yeah. We're focusing primarily on the challenging experiences of awakening, but yeah, all the experiences of whatever you've had happen to you are welcome and important and worthy of being shared when you're ready and disclosing to people who can really hold it.
Yeah. So outside of Instagram, where else can people go to find your work?
Yeah,
Connect
my
with you?
website is thecuriousspirit.org. And yeah, I have a list of the various services and offerings. We have some therapists working with us. And right now, I'm excited to be launching a coaching program specifically for helpers and healers, helping them support their own process. I'm calling it Return to Self. It's a 9-month container. We'll do some transpersonal states work in whatever modality calls to you, and we'll have some retreats, and it'll be a really great way to take care of yourself and meet others in a like-hearted community. So get in touch, thecuriousspirit.org, if that feels good for you.
Yeah, definitely recommend. Katrina was able to give her a referral because I'm on the West Coast, she's on the East Coast, and heard rave reviews and high praise from that person on their experience with Katrina. So, and I just, from getting to know her, I would definitely recommend getting in touch with her and working with her. She's awesome.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much for listening to this very vulnerable episode. It's exciting to have gone there, and I really appreciate you, Katrina, for holding that space and encouraging it. And thank you. I guess that's all I want to say is just thanks for being here and holding the space in your own way. And like I said earlier, like I hope this inspires you to be a little bit more vulnerable about something that you've been holding on to, and just know that there is community out there, and family that will support you and listen and hold space without being judgmental. So until next time, my friends, I'm going to sign off and just kind of bask in that afterglow, I think. So see you next time on The Vital Point. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, I'd love it if you leave a review. Follow me on Instagram at Blue Magic Alchemy if you'd like to learn more about transformation, integration, and how to connect through coaching, breathwork, and meditation. Remember that regardless of the methods you're practicing, the vital point is to practice.